Dawn broke over Western Germany on March 23, 1945, with the low grey light of a continent at the edge of collapse. Beneath the cloud cover, the Rhine cut its ancient path through ruined towns and shattered fields, a river that for centuries had marked the boundary between empires. For Adolf Hitler, it was supposed to be the last natural shield of the Third Reich. For the Allies, it was the final obstacle before the heart of Germany lay open. High above that river, aboard a British command aircraft descending toward the continent, Winston Churchill believed he was arriving to witness a carefully choreographed moment of national redemption. This was meant to be Britain's hour. Operation Plunder, planned down to the smallest detail by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was about to begin. Thousands of guns were already in position. Airborne divisions waited for the signal to drop. Engineers rehearsed river crossings again and again. War correspondents stood ready to record what Churchill hoped would be remembered as proof that British arms still defined modern warfare. Churchill had invested more than resources in this operation. He had invested pride. For months, the British Prime Minister had defended Montgomery's deliberate style against growing American impatience. Preparation, Churchill argued, saved lives. Overwhelming force ensured certainty. This was how Britain fought wars, and Plunder was to be the ultimate demonstration of that philosophy. The largest set-piece river crossing since Normandy, executed with textbook precision, under British command. Then, minutes before landing, the radio crackled. The message was short. Too short. Patton crossed last night. The words landed like a physical blow. Not today, not under Montgomery's 1,000-gun barrage, not with airborne landings and smoke screens, but the night before, with assault boats and a fraction of the men, an American army, moving ahead of schedule, without ceremony, without permission. Churchill said nothing at first. Those around him noticed his expression change, not to anger, but to something colder. He understood instantly what this meant. George Patton had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, quietly, decisively, and in doing so had turned months of British planning into a sideshow. The implications raced ahead of the aircraft. This was not merely a military development, it was a political crisis, one that struck at the fragile balance holding the Allied coalition together. When Montgomery learned of the crossing hours earlier, his reaction had been controlled but lethal. Witnesses later recalled that he did not shout or swear. He simply went still. To him, Patton's move was not bold initiative. It was insubordination at the highest level. A deliberate act that undermined Allied command structure and worse, stole the spotlight from the operation he had been promised would define the end of the war. Within minutes, Montgomery drafted a message to Churchill. The language was precise, clipped, unmistakable. An American general had conducted an unauthorized operation in violation of agreed strategy. Such behavior could not be tolerated. Patton, Montgomery insisted, must be relieved of command immediately. By the time Churchill read that message, the aircraft was already descending. He asked for the facts, and his military secretary delivered them without embellishment. The crossing had succeeded. Casualties were light. The bridgehead was expanding. Patton had done it without elaborate preparation and without coordinating with British command. Churchill looked out the window at the grey patchwork of Germany below and felt the weight of a choice he had been avoiding for years. Montgomery was his man. He embodied everything Churchill admired about British generalship: professionalism, caution, control. Patton represented the opposite: speed, aggression, risk. The American general had embarrassed the British army before the eyes of the world, and Montgomery demanded satisfaction. Yet Patton had done what mattered most. He had crossed the Rhine. Supporting Montgomery meant asking the Americans to fire their most aggressive field commander for winning too quickly. Supporting Patton meant publicly conceding that British methods no longer set the pace of the war. When Churchill stepped onto the airfield, Montgomery was waiting, immaculate and rigid, ready to oversee the opening act of Operation Plunder. Cameras hovered nearby. Staff officers stood at attention. This was supposed to be a moment of triumph. Instead, Churchill asked Montgomery to walk with him. Away from the crowd, Montgomery wasted no time. He demanded Patton's removal, framing it as a matter of discipline, not jealousy. A coalition, he argued, could not function if commanders ignored agreed plans. Success achieved through disobedience was still failure. Churchill listened, then asked a single question. If Patton had asked permission to cross the Rhine the night before, what would you have said? Montgomery answered without hesitation he would have refused. The main effort was scheduled for the following day. Anything else was a distraction. That answer settled something for Churchill. This was no longer about strategy alone. It was about ownership of the victory, about who would write the final chapter of the war. Churchill spoke quietly, but the words cut deep. Patton, he said, had made Montgomery look slow. The accusation hung in the air. Montgomery bristled, defending preparation and discipline as the foundation of professional warfare. Churchill did not dispute that. For years he had championed exactly those values. But now, with Germany collapsing and Soviet armies pushing relentlessly from the east, time had become the most precious commodity of all. Every day spent preparing was a day lost on the map of post-war Europe. Churchill told Montgomery what he had not said aloud before. The war was ending. Speed now mattered more than perfection. Patton understood that reality instinctively. His willingness to move before every variable was controlled had just shattered Germany's last natural defensive line. Montgomery heard the unspoken truth beneath the words. Britain could no longer match that pace. When Montgomery asked bitterly whether Churchill was choosing Patton over him, the Prime Minister shook his head. This was not about loyalty. It was about outcomes, about ending the war before others dictated its conclusion. What Montgomery did not know was that Churchill had been wrestling with this realization for months. He had watched American armies surge across France while British forces advanced methodically. He had seen Bastogne relieved in days while British operations unfolded over weeks. Again and again, American speed delivered results before British planning had finished calculating risk. Standing on that German airfield, Churchill finally acknowledged what pride had kept him from admitting: British doctrine, once the standard of the world, had been overtaken. Montgomery made one final appeal, warning that failing to punish Patton would erode command authority across the coalition. Churchill agreed with him in principle. Patton had violated protocol. In any single national army, consequences would follow. But this was not a single national army. It was an alliance, dominated by the power that supplied most of the men, the equipment, and the money. And that power was no longer Britain. Churchill explained the reality with brutal clarity. If he demanded Patton's dismissal, the Americans would ask why, and the answer would be humiliating. That Britain wanted their most effective general fired for acting too quickly, without British approval. It would sound like wounded pride disguised as discipline. The distant thunder of artillery rolled across the field as Operation Plunder finally began. The meticulously planned crossing unfolded exactly as designed. But everyone present understood that the moment had passed. History's attention had already shifted upstream. Churchill placed a hand on Montgomery's shoulder and spoke with something like regret. History, he said, would remember Montgomery's victories, but it would also remember that an American general crossed the Rhine first. Not because he was braver, not because he was smarter, but because he accepted risks others would not. Montgomery's reply was quiet. He believed he had lost. Churchill corrected him. Britain had lost something deeper than precedence. It had lost the illusion that its way of war still defined the future. The war would be won, but not on British terms. As Churchill returned to his aircraft, he did not watch the crossing he had traveled to see. Inside the cabin, he sat in silence, weighing the consequences of what he was about to do. Then, he dictated a message that would settle the matter. He informed the American Supreme Commander that he would not support Montgomery's request. Patton's operation, though uncoordinated, served Allied objectives. No action should be taken. Before signing, Churchill added a final line in his own hand, a private acknowledgement of the new reality of the war. Keep him moving. The choice was made. Speed had won. The decision did not bring Churchill relief. If anything, it sharpened the unease he had carried since the balance of the war began to shift. That evening, as reports flowed in from the Rhine, it became clear just how decisive Patton's move had been. German units along the river had been caught mid-redeployment, their defenses thin and disorganized. The sudden American crossing shattered any hope of establishing a coherent line. What was meant to be a final barrier dissolved into a series of isolated firefights. Patton's Third Army moved with relentless momentum. Engineers threw bridges across the river almost as quickly as the infantry secured the banks. Armor followed, before German commanders could even determine where the main thrust lay. By the time Operation Plunder's airborne landings were still unfolding, American spearheads were already pushing deeper into central Germany. For Montgomery, the humiliation was profound. His operation succeeded exactly as planned, yet it no longer defined the moment. Months of preparation had delivered a flawless execution, but flawless was no longer enough. In war, perception mattered almost as much as results, and the perception was clear. Britain had arrived with a grand performance. America had arrived early and ended the show. Churchill understood what this meant for the alliance. The United States was no longer simply Britain's indispensable partner. It was the dominant force shaping how the war was fought and how it would be remembered. British influence rested increasingly on diplomacy rather than battlefield initiative, and that shift was irreversible. In private conversations that followed, Churchill did not disguise his frustration. He admired Montgomery's professionalism and still believed his methods had saved lives earlier in the war. But the context had changed. Germany was collapsing faster than Allied planners had anticipated. The true race now was not to Berlin alone, but to shape the political landscape of post-war Europe before Soviet armies occupied too much ground. Patton, reckless and insubordinate as he could be, grasped that reality instinctively. His willingness to act without waiting for approval was not just arrogance, it was an understanding that delay carried its own deadly cost. Montgomery, by contrast, represented a tradition forged in a different era, an era when preparation could compensate for limited resources, when caution was the surest path to victory. Churchill had built his faith in that tradition across decades of imperial warfare. To abandon it now felt like admitting that Britain's strategic mind had been outpaced. The reaction within the British High Command was swift and hostile. Senior officers warned that Churchill's refusal to back Montgomery undermined discipline across Allied forces. If an American general could ignore coordination and suffer no consequences, what message did that send to everyone else? Churchill's response was uncharacteristically blunt. Authority, he argued, did not come from enforcing rules that no longer matched reality. It came from influence, and influence followed power. The Americans, by virtue of their manpower and industrial output, now possessed both. Britain could object, but it could no longer dictate. This was the unspoken truth of coalition warfare. Equality existed on paper, not in practice. The partner who carried the greatest burden ultimately set the tempo. Patton sensed the shift immediately. When he learned that Churchill had declined to support Montgomery's demand, he took it as confirmation that American methods were now decisive. In his own blunt way, he believed the British had finally accepted what he had assumed all along. This war would be finished by those willing to move fastest, not those who waited for perfect alignment. Churchill did not share Patton's confidence. He worried deeply about what this precedent meant. Speed could win wars, but it could also invite catastrophe if misjudged. Yet the alternative, paralysis by caution, now seemed more dangerous. In the days that followed, Allied armies surged forward. German resistance collapsed in pockets, unable to adapt to the pace imposed upon them. The Rhine, once a symbol of German resilience, became merely another obstacle overcome. Behind the scenes, relations between Churchill and Montgomery cooled to a formality. The warmth that had once defined their partnership vanished. Montgomery felt betrayed, not just personally, but institutionally. To him, Churchill had sacrificed British military honor for political expediency. Churchill saw it differently. Honor, he believed, lay in ending the war as swiftly as possible and bringing soldiers home alive. Prestige mattered, but lives mattered more. And every day shaved off the war's duration saved thousands. Late one night, exhausted and contemplative, Churchill met privately with his physician. Away from staff and ministers, he spoke with rare candor. He admitted that the choice he had made cut against decades of belief. Britain, he said, was no longer the senior military power in the alliance. That role had passed quietly, not through defeat, but through comparison. The realization stung more than any German victory ever had. Britain had not lost because it was weak. It had lost its primacy because others had learned to wage war faster. Churchill did not regret his decision, but he understood its symbolism. In choosing not to punish Patton, he had acknowledged a new hierarchy. The empire that once defined modern warfare was now adapting to it. The Rhine crossing became a case study in the brutal economics of coalition war. Rules mattered, but results mattered more. Pride could inspire, but it could also delay. And delay, in the final months of a global conflict, carried consequences measured in lives and territory. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was how history would judge the men who shaped its final moments. Montgomery would be remembered for precision and professionalism, Patton for audacity and speed. And Churchill, caught between them, would be remembered for making a choice that quietly acknowledged the end of one era and the beginning of another. The decision at the Rhine was not about one river crossing. It was about who would define the future of warfare when the guns finally fell silent. As the Allied advance accelerated, the implications of that moment on the Rhine became impossible to ignore. German command structures, already strained by shortages and internal distrust, simply could not respond to the tempo imposed upon them. Orders arrived too late. Reserves were committed to positions that had already been bypassed. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot, convinced the war had outrun them. Patton's method was not elegant, but it was devastating. He treated the battlefield as a problem of time rather than terrain. Rivers, towns, and defensive lines were obstacles only if allowed to become pauses. To Patton, hesitation was the true enemy. Every hour lost was an opportunity granted to the Germans to regroup, or worse, to the Soviets to advance further west. Churchill watched the map change daily, the front lines stretching and bending in ways that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. The American advance after the Rhine did not merely accelerate the collapse of Germany, it reshaped Allied assumptions about control. Commanders who could move fast dictated events. Those who waited for consensus reacted to them. In London, ministers struggled to reconcile this new reality with Britain's self-image. For generations, British officers had been taught that war was an exercise in management, not momentum. Precision mattered, control mattered. But now, control seemed to belong to those willing to accept disorder in exchange for speed. Churchill defended his decision publicly, with careful language, but privately he acknowledged its deeper meaning. Britain was no longer leading by example. It was negotiating relevance within an alliance increasingly driven by American scale and urgency. The British chiefs of staff pressed their concerns, warning that discipline once eroded could not be restored. Churchill listened, but he did not reverse course. He understood that discipline enforced selectively was worse than none at all. If Patton were punished while delivering victories, resentment would fester. The Americans would not accept it quietly. Across the Atlantic, American leaders drew their own conclusions. The refusal to discipline Patton was seen as tacit approval of aggressive initiative. Commanders were encouraged implicitly to act boldly when opportunity presented itself. The result was an Allied advance that became less coordinated in form, but more unified in effect. Germany's final weeks were chaotic. Cities fell in rapid succession, defensive plans dissolved under pressure from multiple directions. The Rhine, once envisioned as a final stand, faded into memory as the Allies surged beyond it. For Montgomery, the episode left a permanent mark. He continued to command effectively, but his relationship with Churchill never recovered its earlier warmth. He believed the Prime Minister had chosen expedience over principle, speed over structure. In his view, Patton had been rewarded for breaking the rules that held coalitions together. Churchill, however, saw the matter differently. Coalitions survived not on rules alone, but on outcomes. Victory, once within reach, demanded choices that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The luxury of perfect coordination vanished as the end approached. In his later reflections, Churchill returned often to the Rhine crossing. He did not deny Montgomery's brilliance or the value of preparation. Instead, he framed the moment as a turning point, not just in the campaign, but in the nature of warfare itself. Industrial-scale conflict, he concluded, favored those who could mobilize and move with overwhelming speed. Patton's success forced Britain to confront a truth it had resisted since 1942. The empire that once taught the world how to fight was now learning from its ally. This was not a humiliation born of defeat, but of comparison. Britain had not failed. It had been surpassed. The American approach carried risks, Churchill admitted. Speed without discipline could lead to disaster if unchecked. But in the final months of the war, risk had become unavoidable. The greater danger lay in caution that allowed events to outrun decision-makers. As Allied forces closed in on Germany's remaining centers of power, the question was no longer whether the war would end, but how quickly and on whose terms. Churchill's choice at the Rhine ensured that speed would dominate the final act. When the guns finally fell silent, historians would debate the merits of preparation versus momentum. They would analyze casualty figures, operational maps, and command decisions. But beneath those analyses lay a simpler truth revealed on a cold March morning in 1945. The future belonged to those who moved first. Montgomery had fought the war Britain had prepared for. Patton fought the war that existed. Churchill, standing between them, chose to acknowledge that difference, even when it wounded national pride. The Rhine crossing did not just open the road to Berlin, it marked the moment Britain accepted its new place in the alliance. No longer the unquestioned architect of victory, but still an essential partner, adapting to a faster, harsher reality. In that acceptance lay both loss and survival. Pride was sacrificed, influence endured, and the war ended sooner because of it. That was the price Churchill was willing to pay.